Hello everyone, today we come back to Cananaean and Syrian warfare between the 18th and the 13th century BC. We already discussed its tactics. Today we discuss its military organization. So, just a brief reminder that the Canaanites, occupying this territory at large, also including parts of Syria, were a Semitic-speaking people who inhabited the Levant, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Western Jordan, and parts of Syria. From at least the 3rd millennium BC, their origins are tied to the broader Northwest Semitic population, likely emerging from local Bronze Age cultures like the Gasulian one that are basically like mid-5th to mid-4th millennium BC, in blending with migrating Semitic groups coming from different hinterlands. As we'll see now, there were also other ethnic influences, but one thing at a time. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests they developed from indigenous peoples and Amorite influences. We talked about Amorite warfare for that matter, so you can get a grasp, in fact, of what we're discussing between these more sedentary, urbanized peoples and the ones of the Levantine hinterland, forming a distinct identity by the Middle Bronze Age, so roughly this 2nd millennium BC. They were not a single unified group, but a collection of city-states sharing language, religion, for example, the worship of Baal and El, and material culture. Again, this is not a simply, sort of, we could say, civilian history video. We talk about warfare, but surely we will at some point expand also on the more evidential political history of these peoples aside from their armies. Now, the term Canaan itself historically designated the territory extending essentially from Egypt up to Lebanon. The etymology is uncertain but likely derives from a Semitic root kn, which means to be low or to bend, possibly referring to the lowland geography of the region, or a sense of subjugation of some sort. It may also be connected to the Akkadian kinau, referring to a reddish-purple dye traded in the area, which is basically the same etymology for the later Phoenicians in the same region, the Phoenikoi of the Hellenic records, that people say, it's just that crustaceos they used for dyeing clothes, but actually the red there that's how lowly materialistic our, in fact, silly explanations of the world have been. Of course, the red was deeply connected with the traditional notion of royalty. The purple, and so it's not like the crustaceous gave the name to the people. That was a much higher point to it all. I made multiple videos on sacred royalty and tradition, so I'm not going to descend into this again. So, retennu is another term here, serving as a general label for both Syria and Palestine, while the Egyptians refer to Palestine as Jahi. As you understand here, we're talking the broader Egyptian, that is, civilizational perspective on this northern frontier. Retennu or retenu is in fact the Egyptian term used broadly for the Levant at large, including Syria and Palestine. Its etymology is unclear. It may stem from an Egyptian adaptation of a local Semitic name or a descriptive term for distant lands, though no precise root is confirmed, while Jai, or Jai, of course these are transliterated terms from names that are not properly written with the Latin alphabet, as you understand, so you can find it spelled and probably pronounced regardless of what the experts would say in different ways, is another term, Egyptian term, for southern Palestine, rather, so the closest part of the region to Egypt. Its etymology is obscure as well, possibly an Egyptian rendering, again, of a Semitic place name or a generic label for a coastal or foreign region of some sort, but it lacks a clear linguistic origin. In any case, this is the area we're looking at today. That's why it's important also to conceptualize from the Egyptian perspective. We'll come back on Egyptian warfare probably soon. This region was politically split into a multitude of city-states, each under the rule of a king, also known in Semitic as Melik, which you also know basically from the later Arab political system. Melik, or so Malik, it's the equivalent of, say, if you want, the Latin Rex, except in Arabic, like, it has a completely different semantics, actually a negative one, whereas Rex in our Indo-European background is really that sense of sacred royalty. Instead, at least in the later Islamic vision, it was probably in fact very different from this one at this point. Is considered like as an usurper of God's power. But in fact, here we're in different times. Melik or Malk comes from the West Semitic rule milk, meaning to rule or king, simply. It was a common title for rulers across Canaanite city-states, reflecting their status as local sovereigns, naturally clothed with a divine aura. Needless to say, as we'll understand better now, these Canaanite city-states were pretty much warring against one another, which is not a good recipe for political stability. But of course, you have sort of powerful neighbors in terms of the Egyptians, as we'll see in the north, the more also barbarian like Hurrian and Mitanni. Now, the geography of the area is also interesting here because it is and was remarkably varied. Fertile plains and valleys where urban centers were established were separated by hills cloaked in cedar woodlands or brush. Beyond these, to the east stretched the Syrian steppe, occupied by nomadic groups who regularly ventured into the arable regions to devastate them. So you have basically the recipe for very interesting military culture that normally, in fact, is quite high in at least local relative quality. Like you have the city-states organizing themselves to mostly compete against one another, possibly hegemonize each other, even though it's difficult. You have these fringe areas, these divides from the woodlands that can host also exiles, guerrilla fighters, and also less civilized peoples, plus these nomads from the desert that every once in a while exploiting the cyclical civilizational crises that occur in the Levant, right, to lay waste to crops, bringing them home, and try in some cases also to settle themselves in, for example, in the north. This would happen in Syria, like with the Amorites, also in the with the Neo-Hittite rulers by. So there was a way to essentially exploit even these movements of savages. Now, key city-states in Canaan included Amurru, Kinza, also known as Kadesh, Mukish, that is Alalach, Ugarit, Gubla, that would be Byblos, Nukashe, Tunip, Katna, and Kalba, the latter being Aleppo, as a matter of fact. So this tells you, by the way, how ancient, of course, certain cultures there are, regardless of how they end up, of course, depending on vicissitudes of various kinds. And so these city-states varied in power naturally. Politically, we're looking at, of course, a very long stretch in history. Politically, they were autonomous from one another, but often they were, of course, vassals to greater powers like Egypt, the Mitanni, or the Hittites. Militarily, they relied on what we will see now: small, localized forces constituted typically by chariots, infantry, and archers. At this point, there isn't really cavalry as we understand it, supplemented by also foreign mercenaries. Kadesh and Katna were the strongest cities in Canaan due to strategic locations and alliances, while Byblos and Ugarit leaned on trade wealth rather than military might. This may be just a cliche, they did pretty much the same things, but this seemed to be a bit more the balance. Amurru and Aleppo could field notable forces, but were inconsistent in dominance. Wars among these city-states were just endemic, like a common occurrence, periodical, seasonal affair, and more to an extent. Besides, there were those aforementioned disruptive incursions by nomadic Bedouins and the so-called Apiru or Abiru. We will look at these rogues and outcasts later. The term Abir has no clear etymology, but may relate to a Semitic root per, which means dust or to wander. And we'll see now how there is an actual connection with the Hebrews, etymologically speaking, which from a Canaanite perspective of the Jews is quite fascinating, hinting at their nomadic or marginalized status. You know that the same Jews initially were mostly like a pastoral people from the interland, and so they had that they were literally descending from the mountains to raid in the same way. In fact, it's a social label for outcasts, bandits, runaways, or laborers rather than an ethnic one, appearing across Mesopotamian in Egyptian texts, of course, because of the relatively shared etymologies and mutuations for that matter. As we said before, the Canaanites were in between mostly the major powers of Egypt in the south and the Mitanni and the Hatti, so to say, in the north. The latter were, say, the Mitanni were primarily Hurrian and ethnic speaking and non-Semitic, however also apparently non-Indo-European language, with surely nevertheless an Indo-Aryan elite ruling estate, evidenced by names and terms like Mariana, that is also quite famous, we will talk about later, and that, as you understand, hinted at also the idea of an Indo-European lordship of some kind of more native ethnic communities, as Indo-European warriors were coming from Central Asia at that point, spreading everywhere, and so installing themselves as lords in these people. But it was also a complex mechanism whereby also the local aristocracies intermarried. The Hatti, the Hittites, were an Indo-European people whose language derived from the Anatolian branch, distinct, of course, from the Semitic neighbors. I made a video, or multiple videos actually, about the Neo-Hittite kingdoms that are also relatively similar in terms of this practically city-states, fragmentation, competition to the Canaanites. That's why Syria was actually a sort of hybrid land in many ways. This northern frontier for Canaan is quite dynamic. We'll, however, talk also about the previous, the old, so to say, Hittite warfare that, as you know, is one of the most important in the history of the Bronze Age in the art of war. And obviously, such neighboring powers took advantage of the Canaanite regional disputes to broaden their authority. The Canaanites were not so cohesive to simply withstand the onslaught at different times, and they would, in fact, end up, as we just said, to be client states of those powers that couldn't quite simply take over the entire system themselves. There was a lot of mostly vassalitic relations at play, and a lot of proxy warfare between the two sides into Canaan, obviously enough. Plus, there were other peoples, as we will see now, that interfered, as always, and as everybody did with one another. In fact, meanwhile, the Canaanite leaders cleverly pitted these major powers against each other in turn to pursue their own goals. A notable example is Adziru of Amurru, who mastered this policy during Akhenaten's pharaoh's reign, 1379-1362 BC. Adziru of Amurru was this shrewd Amorite ruler, initially a vassal of Egypt under the aforementioned pharaoh Akhenaten. He exploited Amurru's influence through diplomacy and opportunism. He clashed with neighbors like Rib Adda of Byblos, eventually aligning with the Hittites against Egypt. His military actions included seizing Tunip and raiding Egyptian territories, balancing small-scale campaigns with political maneuvering. It's really typical of the most ambitious Canaanite rulers. The military strength of Canaanite forces rested largely on their exceptional territory, manned by a privileged group of noble warriors called Mariana. As we were saying before, Mariana or Marianu likely comes from an Indo-Aryan term, Maria, meaning young man, or warrior, obviously referring to the Aryan background, properly the noble race of the holy warriors, brought to the Levant by Mitanni elites in particular. You find the term used among many others non-Indo-European peoples exactly because would be plenty of these adventurers that in a way or another infiltrated the system, that, as you know, wasn't particularly impermeable, nor politically, nor territorially. Chariot warfare at this point in history is the dominant one. At least some point out that the term chariot warfare is improper because there weren't just chariots, obviously. Here, the chariot, however, is a broader meaning of lordly dominance, the mounted arm that had, in the Bronze Age, a disproportionate importance in terms, if you look just at the costs of it. We made multiple videos about Bronze Age chariot types that in fact were fairly well documented about also for the various peoples. I made a video actually about the same Mitanni Hurri chariot of the era. So if you want to look at that, you can understand how really expensive they were, how delicate, how they really required a lot of maintenance. Just the richest powers could maintain an adequate park of those, right? And so these Canaanite powers, as a matter of fact, were, as we were saying at the beginning, individually in merit of the individual cities, states, particularly warlike, right? They had very high quality chariots, influenced surely by this had been brought by the Indo-Europeans historically, but now had really entered from millennia into warfare of all these other updated powers, so to say. And again, the Canaanites ruled essentially the coastlands, right? So potentially also the lowlands, and these places are, regardless of, as we've seen, those natural obstacles, terrain, etc., could and would exist and would be exploited in many cases. Use such chariots on flat ground, right? So, the same Levant was crossed by Egyptian armies, massive ones. That this is the same area where the Battle of Kadesh happened. So there is really a lot of chariot warfare going on, to make the long story short. And the Canaanites are quite advanced in their mastery. Then, as I was saying before, there is not just chariots around. We will see this now, but fundamentally, chariot was the upper arm, right? You can't say the decisive one in this period, because before the sea peoples that arrived at large towards the end of the period, with tougher infantry capable of withstanding chariots, hail of arrows and charges especially. We're talking here something similar you see to feudal cavalry in the 13th century. Infantry was necessary, combined arms were the basics of these armies, but chariots were stronger. By the way, the aforementioned Mariana really speaks of that heroic champion culture that even this more apparently civic rather than civilized states would express. In fact, we should not confuse just city-states with any form of what we understand of republican or democratic ethos, if not just maybe in relation to other powers, more feudal ones, more also nomadic ones. But this word that, as we've seen, traces back to the Indo-European root, meaning youth or hero, came into use in Canaanite culture with the rise of the chariot-based combat at the beginning of the era in question. We think, in fact, that the Canaanite chariot as such finds its origin with Hurrians and Mitanni, whose martial traditions had a profound impact on Canaanite warfare. Again, everything is explained in that Hurri-Mitannian chariot video. The Canaanite population included a significant Hurrian component, by the way, especially among the Mariana themselves, which is kind of obvious given that these were, again, the more warlike peoples of the north, constantly pressing on the frontier, that as a result became a hybrid between the two ethnicities, the two cultures. And Mariana was a skilled chariot fighter, affluent enough to sustain a 2-horse chariot, because, of course, this warfare was mostly a privilege of those who owned more, since ever power was measured, of course, in such way, in a political system that does not find a more functional way to form further power and stability, but through such adventures at the time, that eventually, however, had to rely on a landed asset in order to maintain their chariots. In many ways, they could be mercenaries, they could be patronized by the different rulers locally or abroad. So there were literally errant charioteers out there, but they still had some sort of retinue, some sort of following that was connected to a more stable political context. Consider that this came together with armor and gear that in the Bronze Age was pretty costly affair as well. At least at the top level, think about, I don't know, the Dendra panoply, just to make an example. Fighting into that means to almost pass out under hallucinations, etc., because of the sheer psychophysical strength that entails. But this is a world where literally demigods are present on the battlefields, and in fact, the individual capacities of Mariana was astonishing, to say the least. We will talk more in depth about chariot combat, so to say. The aforementioned video about the Hurrian Mitanni chariot does address this, and there was a lot of switching of different arms, like from melee to missile combat, requiring some veritably athletic, but not properly heroic capacities. This affluence usually, as we were saying, stemmed from land ownership tied to a duty to serve the king. So as literal vassals of sorts that would go on their own adventures in a typically feudal fashion. Each Mariano also oversaw a team, as we just stated, that included, in the typical tactical formula of the so-called regular armies of the most conventional warfare in the bigger engagements, a driver for the chariot, of course, grooms for the men, for the horses, and a modest contingent of infantry or runners, as they were called, because they literally had to run after the chariot, not to leave it. That's also one of the most interesting aspects of the story. That's also how cavalry was literally born, right? At this point, there already were horsemen, but there wasn't cavalry as we fully understand it, meaning that you can have a bunch of runners in loose order that follow you, but having a thickly compact shock charge unit is a complete on horseback is a completely different thing. By now, the most conventional type of runner was an infantryman that had to support charioteers in combat, trying to pull down the enemy opponents from the mountains, and also to take out one another. Chariots were designed for being particularly maneuverable at this point. As you know, they entailed some sort of caracole type of tactics. But, of course, they were unwieldy, vulnerable in certain terrain especially. And so, as we were saying before, describing the Cananaean landscape, you would find situations where they could be in trouble as well. And as we've seen also in other videos about chariot warfare, embankments, canals, think about in Mesopotamia, since the beginning, were heavily exploited in order to achieve conditions of disparity. Of course, this is technically, conceptually, still the Fertile Crescent, but we're not in Iraq, which is basically just a flatland. Yes, it does have marshes. It has, of course, the same rivers that make it the fertile, the sort of crescent, at least eastern end. But in fact, Canaan is different. This is Lebanon. There are mountains, there are hills, there are heavy woodlands in some areas, there's broken terrain, so it's a different story. Nevertheless, still, yes, of course, there are open plains, otherwise the city-states could have never really flourished, right, properly from the harvest, from the surplus of the surrounding countryside, nor they could have supplied, in fact, such relevant, especially top-notch chariot units. Typically, the Mariana status was passed down through families. It was inheritable and was initially granted by the king, though it's conceivable that merchants and artisans alongside the landed gentry could also supply Mariana. This is interesting for two other reasons. First of all, because we see a ruler that can sort of maintain a decent amount of order after all, regardless of this, in fact, prolific landscape as far as the number of city-states was concerned. But again, this means that there was wealth around and, of course, more developed political systems capable of bringing order, taming a bit these adventures was there. So actually, the term Mariana stemmed from, again, the bowels of the steppes, from the great Indo-European conquerors of the era that were the race of the no kings. Not that they lacked authority or hierarchy, but that ideally, as heroes, were purely free, and so their noble status derived from some divinity that could even challenge one of kings, especially in areas like this Semitic world that they would have looked upon with sort of more contempt, also in a sort of moral and even physical sense. But of course, civilization is not an option, so also this Canaanite rulers know their deal, and they are themselves sometimes of the same Indo-European ancestry for that matter. That's not the point. The point here is to think how structured the power was. And of course, if there was enough wealth, as we've seen, there were some city-states that were famous for trade, for commerce. There would be a third estate. That would be the merchants, the artisans. And it's, of course, conceivable that especially the landed gentry, so they were technically not by birth into a warlike business. They just found themselves to be affluent enough to sustain, however, a Mariana lifestyle that would be levied by the local rulers. This is really typical. We find it a bit in every kind of context. And it's difficult in here even to say what was the actual line between let's say, a traditional Mariana and one of these third estaters that naturally were eager to rise up through the ranks in status to become even wealthier, because at the end of the day, that's also what the merchants were aiming to, becoming a fully fledged nobility. Without mentioning that without merchants and artisans, there couldn't be chariots, there couldn't be an effective logistics supplying system, there couldn't be properly the replacements, the very chariots, as a matter of fact. And again, it was very costly and very complicated to build chariots. The same public authorities invested, public, we say, of course, everything is blurred here in terms of private and public, because there is not like we say city-states here, but it's not like the state, a univocal authority. It's mostly like a lord that rules over other clans, right? But whatever heads towards that civic statal direction invests dramatically in the arsenals and in this, in fact, officines that built up and repaired chariots, because they were constantly needed to be constantly upkept. It was extremely costly, but necessary because it was that effective. I discussed this a bit in the video about Bronze Age warfare in general. I'm glad that we have by now tens of videos on Bronze Age warfare. But you know what's the background here. Just to give you an example, Canaanite kings, not only those, kept a select group of elite Mariana as their personal guard, right? And of course, Mariana here doesn't refer to the chariot per se, because of course the hero would dismount from the chariot. Ideally, it was a dueling championship of some sort, and as you see in the poems, you think about Gilgamesh Epos, etc. Like also, these are the same years in which, in theory, like the War of Troy was to be fought in the latter part, and even the Indo-European epos of shared intensely with this Levantine world that was also infested, in fact, by Indo-Europeans. So it's all baked into it. It's that kind of vibe. The Marianas were trained to fight in every kind of situation, every kind of weapon, and they were really pretty darn good. Not alone, however. The idea of single combat is overly emphasized. Of course, it could happen in certain ritual contexts, but real warfare was, as we've seen, a matter of leaders, yes, but of retinues as well. And in a sense here, the king's retinue was the Marianas. The term Nearin is also fascinating, as it shows up in Ugaritic writings, in Egyptian documents, as a term for the Canaanite foes themselves, and later in Hebrew as a designation for top-tier soldiers, right? And Nearin, or Nar in Semitic languages, stems from the root Ner, meaning youth or servant. It evolved from, again, denoting young attendants to elite soldiers in Ugaritic Egyptian, later Hebrew usage, reflecting their role as vigorous, loyal fighters. This, in fact, designates not much retinues, but fully fledged Marianas, likely. A group of Nearin who aided Rameses II at the Battle of Kadesh, for example, might have been allies from Amurru, remember the aforementioned Canaanite proxies, and so this term probably refers to elite Mariana rather than actual retainers. Again, there was a very chivalric feudal culture whereby, a bit like squires, there are these attendants, retainers that basically rise to some kind of nobiliar position. They were part of the war band, in a sense, because there is a very strong war band culture here too. And so the idea is that the lower elements, the youth, etc., were, for example, better runners, or they were crazier, they were more expandable. And so you would literally select them through brutal combat, and then they could aspire to become, just out of their sheer warrior capacity, Marianas themselves. And in fact, there wasn't like a document like in Biblos said, okay, I stamp you here, you're a Mariana, this is your certificate. They would just acquire their own power by feats of arms, and in fact testing everybody's boundaries in this. And a Mariana's lifespan, as you can easily predict, was not particularly extended over time. But again, the sheer military performance was utterly insane. Right, these were people who literally chopped to pieces tens of human beings in single engagements. Right, so really they were designed for that. And again, their life wouldn't be particularly long, but they also, hopefully transfigured in the Imperium if they were managing to tame their own mortality a bit in the process. Now, as we've seen, these leaders and their retinues weren't the only, they were really the backbone of the Canaanite armies, and not only, but they weren't the only fighters in the picture. Most regular foot soldiers were actually drafted from the peasant estates, termed upshu. These represented the underclass, in a sense, or at least there were different estates, as you understand here, but the concept of nobility stemmed from the regular exercise of arms. As we will see, of course, some peasants were free at large. And in fact, the actual levy of Cananaean infantrymen were free land-owning citizens, so to say, because they participated into the city's political and military life. But they were rather obligated to serve in labor or war when called upon. So there were different levels, and most of them weren't actually that thrilled to go to war. But they weren't bad. I mean, this was just the system that you can find pretty much all across the sanitary world, at least a certain level of political organization. In the Amarna correspondence, for example, we see infantry being identified by the Akkadian phrases sabe shepi and sabe bithati. Now, what are the etymologies of this word? So for the peasant class of the Upshu, we know that the term derives from a Semitic root meaning free, but at the same time possibly lowly or lowly, but we don't clearly know all of the meanings here. But these were in fact the lower freemen, but even in a deterior sense, referring to peasant laborers or at best tenant farmers in Canaanite society, the conscripts mostly serving as infantrymen. In contrast, the Akkadian for foot soldiers, Sabeshep is in fact Sep meaning foot, and Sababitati it refers to household troops from Bitu house. So that in the Amarna letters they denote some kind of organized infantry, likely of higher status than the Hupshu. Possibly also not just infantrymen, especially for the latter household troops. But it still suggests a distinction in role or origin rather than etymology that in fact corresponds to this social stratification you find in the Cananaean world as well. From our iconographic sources, we understand that the Cananaean infantrymen were generally equipped as likely armed archers or spearmen. These two typologies, of course, do not surprise us, but our understanding is also that an in-between, like some kind of heavier infantry type, was not really in the equation unless we're discussing properly dismounted Marianas. Of course, there would have been some kind of heavier armored infantrymen that would serve just like that because, say, he could not afford a chariot, and remember, there is no cavalry, so it's also more likely, in a sense, that such a stratum would exist regardless of our iconographic evidence. But it's also, from some side, a very well-organized world that increasingly relies on chariot warfare in this sense. So for the other troops to be just standing against chariots would not make much sense. It would just follow them, as we've seen, and support them. And so, especially during this period specifically, the necessity of having strong, heavy infantry was quite not there. Conversely, you would see a lot of very good hit-and-run tactics versus, let's say, Canaan fighters. Not everybody was living in the city. There was a lot of primitivity in general in this world, also as far as armament is concerned. So it would be, we're not here discussing unit types, but it would be sort of a range of wider, of course, typologies of troops, not that heavy in nature. In fact, the interaction with the chariots required certain light character. The infantry could take a backseat to the chariotry, providing support in combat in that way, which in fact differed from Egyptian military strategy. Right, and part of the reason is that this chariotry, even though it's very good, it's overall less organized than the bigger. I mean, Egypt is just the biggest one, so it would tend to overwhelm just strategically any opponent. These Cananaean city-states will, in the dire straits, just shut their gates and sort of defend from their rocks rather than attempting some open confrontation. But given that there is a lot of that guerrilla and resurgent capacity in this decentralized world in between bigger powers, of course this speed, this agility, jumping on chariot and dismounting, quick actions, that kind of, again, hit-and-run tactics and mentality is there, right? And generally speaking, even from an individual point of view, there would be more tendentially warlike individuals. Just this mirrors also less general collective training at large. Specialized infantry units were definitely there, especially in the palaces of the Cananaean city-states as royal protectors, which makes a lot of sense. We find royal archers under Piryabadza of Damascus, for example. And as we said before, it's just like the dismounted Marianas. Like if you wanted elite troops, you couldn't find plenty from them. And their retinues, by the way. Here we find archers proper. Archery was very important in chariot warfare because, as you know, the same champions very much versed in archery, and they passed, as we were hinting at before, from melee to missile pretty quickly. So the same concept of archery is more divinely associated in the Levant than it is, for example, in the West. Piravadza or Biravadza of Damascus was active in the Amarna period, that is the 14th century BC, at the end of our timeline here, as a Canaanite ruler under Egyptian suzerainty. His military record is sparse, but he managed local defense and supplied troops to Pharaoh, as seen in Amarna letters EA 194. He faced pressure from, quote, Apiro raiders in rival cities, maintaining power through diplomacy rather than notable campaigns. Canaanite rulers were also wealthy enough to reinforce their armies with Shasu or Sutu Bedouins, Apiro, troops provided by their imperial masters as well, so respectively as these auxiliary nomads from the desert, the Apiro that we have here already explained before, like the Abiru, the connection possibly with the Hebrews. Our troops literally sent from Egypt. Actually, of course, there would be some sort of coalitions within the same Canaanite world for which they would support one another, they would coagulate forces, also from the Uri-Mitanni and also other foreign peoples. Now, the label Apiru or Abiru that we pointed to before, connecting to dust or to wonder, has been associated as not much with an ethnic reference, but mostly with the connection with banditry, runaways, or even laborers of some sort, so some kind of scum of the earth, some kind of like saying, I don't know, the Brabantsoni in the 12th century, the Écorcheurs during the 100 Years' War, some sort of rogue force that derived also from the very violent, as you understand, political life of these communities that routinely expels the opposite clans that took refuge elsewhere, etc. There were lots of these also scattered across the Levant and beyond, the Middle East. So outlaws, runaways, desert wanderers, associated to the dust. It's also a symbolical term. It shouldn't be understood in material terms. Like this, the people who had fallen out of grace properly and to a level of misery that was incompatible at some point, for example, from the capacity of having a war chariot, which, as we've seen, was an indicator of status of power. It's complicated, of course, to look into this because we don't have too much detail, right? But it's obvious that there was a very strong moral implication also connected with war. For example, these Abiru were also settled enemies, right? It was almost a contempt term. In fact, the similarity between this term and Hebrews has fueled much discussion in historiography because the Canaanites fought against the Hebrews, and it's plausible that they would use this name properly to define them, leading eventually to the adoption of the term itself for the Jews, which, of course, is hotly debated. It's not demonstrated, but from a Canaanite perspective, does make some sense because the Hebrews, again, were the shepherds from the highlands that came to raid, etc. So gradually attacked this more coastal areas, like much later on. So it's an interesting etymology, but it gives you an idea also of this, on the backdrop of this allegedly, again, statal urban context, how many wanderers, how many, can't say tribesmen just per se, because that's a slightly different thing. These people are mostly the product of the local communities, right? But there are also those warriors from the outer world, and that's where it gets interesting, as we've seen with the Mariana as well. And this Hapiru and Abiru were certainly rugged and ferocious, but also unpredictable and disloyal. We've seen so much military history and so much sort of habit regarding the presence of such elements that we're not really surprised by anything here. By the way, the Apiro often work as hired fighters remember, the routier, the Brabants, again, those were soldiers. So here we're even talking, again, of a context where, of course, the dispossessed would at some point try the military career, but there was somebody who was rich enough to hire them and so to turn them into some de facto professional soldiery, not in the sense that, again, there were massively drilled, disciplined armies, etc., especially of these infantrymen around. But they were, these mercenary forces you could throw in and a bit expandable in a way. And God knows also from where they came from, how far away they could come from different areas. We talked a lot about, we've seen it with the Amorites, we've seen it with the same Arabs in general. Like if you enter basically the east of this territory, what are the Arabs in a broader sense is there. So just in terms of the Bedouins and the way of war, this was true also in North Africa. We've seen it in different videos. Did always practice that type of warfare, and they were incredibly primitive, backwards and underdeveloped. They weren't much of a countercultural force either. For example, Pirabads of Damascus, we talked about before, had friendly Sultan Apiru in his ranks, these Bedouins and outcasts. So obviously they would be higher here. A distinction shouldn't even be made, but since there is this broader sense that, of course, these peoples came from the desert and they were not compatible with civilization, if not by sort of, again, raiding their fields, etc., that they were hopelessly enemies. Really not. It's just like, I don't know, say the Romans and the barbarian federati or whatever. It was a complex relation. Surely not just a nice one, as it's evident. But you could find these forces pretty much everywhere. Independent Apiru were a serious danger to Canaanite urban centers, nevertheless. These groups could be well armed, by the way, and sometimes even had chariots themselves. There's really nothing to be surprised of. It's, again, imagine war bands in history, like mercenaries. They fought, they could be of all kinds. Right, and of course a bit less structured than other forces, but imagine free companies roaming around, where also the Marianas were, as we were saying before. It's difficult to tell like one from the other. Now, a key duty for Canaanite city-state forces was controlling the actions of Apiru and desert nomads as well. We've seen different tactics were implemented by, for example, the Assyrians later on against the Arab nomads. They were pretty much the same. And we also discussed this a bit in the aforementioned video on Canaanite and Syrian tactics. Not just much about that, but talking about the Arabs mostly. The nomads, we did so. It was important to, for example, poison their wells to advancing with large forces, which was complicated in the desert, of course. But once you managed to tap all their major oases, right, their supply stations, fundamentally, you could simply push them in the desert to not much avail in the end of the day, but the destruction could inflict upon them was enough at times to, for example, just to repress them into subjection for a while, so generations sometimes. So it really depends. Things were much more immediate when a power withdrew. These guys came back. But let's say the scale of destruction in this incredibly primitive and materially poor world at the end of the day, especially for nomads in the desert, can really affect a lot of their strategic and operational capacities. And so, in any case, some of these bands were sizable and threatening. Records from Alalak document a Sutu group, for example, of these Bedouins specifically, of 1436 men, to be precise, with 80 charioteers, which is actually a lot. Like, chariots varied naturally in size and weight, etc., so this would have been tendenzially lighter, we can imagine. But of course, those chariots were there, and 1,000 Shananu. Were likely archers, by the way. So we do not know much about these terms, unfortunately. But you understand here that there was the same, more or less, at least the same kind of segmentation organically and tactically for the other civilized armies. This is a pretty sizable force, by the way. Consider that Alalak itself could only field 31 Mariana from a male population of roughly 1,200 plus 22 nearby villages with populations between 1 and 500. So they're not, again, Canaan is fragmented in all the city-states. It's not like it's a consistent country, as you understand here, of essentially provincial scale, depending, because again, in some of our languages, including mine, provincial means something truly like smaller, right? In the Anglosphere, provinces can be bigger, right? And region most is like the size of entire, modern, in fact, medium-sized countries. So something at the time was hardly achievable, if not by probably the largest powers around. But imagine, in fact, that provincial context in the bigger sense, being fragmented. And of course, the city-states, as we said before, just for the sheer fact that they existed, let's be honest about this, really reveal the fact that they had the resources to withstand one another, which is terrifying, right? This resembles other sort of city-states contexts. Again, not just the Neolithic ones, for example, would develop in the north later on, that in fact were very similar to this to some extent, even though there were less urbanized areas in comparison to what basically Phoenicia had become. In fact, also the naval development there is interesting. I made a video about the Phoenician bireme from the 8th century BC, so half a millennium later here, but they were same places, and there is an interesting story there. Of course, here the sea peoples had yet to fully arrive in force, etc. So it's a very different landscape. But as you understand here, that there is even a relatively strong element of Marianas, because the chariots were extremely expensive, but they were extremely expensive for those times relative possibilities. Weren't extremely expensive in the sense that in absolute terms a chariot of the Bronze Age cost so much in absolute terms. So what you actually see compared to, say, medieval feudal realities, that these Marianas are actually more frequent than, a medieval knight would actually be back in the day, in that context. So we also look at sort of the bigger chariots. We tend to think just the most updated, the more technologically advanced ones, but I can imagine that would be different kinds, including support. Towards the later period, you find even horsemen being relevant in some way, but always in that loose fashion. And again, the chariot was dominant, but it wasn't dominant everywhere, just like, the medieval knight had his mount at some point. And these guys are something similar to that. And just for saying how these hordes of dispossessed were actually a freaking problem. We've seen this with in other contexts as well. In, for example, my videos here. Yeah. The Amorites, I made a video about the Amorite warrior, telling the truth from the previous period to this, from the 22nd to the 18th century BC. And that explains a lot because it shows you how their modus operandi, by the way, didn't really change too much in the later period either, worked. They were literally on foot. In this later period, as we just stated, actually they weren't, especially in the closer to the more developed areas, of course. But in general, they were so poor, they were just going around like that with, packing stuff on donkeys and literally walking on foot in the desert in this paths that they only could recognize, knowing precisely, the exact timing not to die of thirst, and which was, as we were saying before, also an obstacle for whoever wanted to chase them back, by the way. We know of one Canaanite village being overrun by a Sutu force of Bedouins, of 17 foot soldiers, 7 charioteers, and 4 Mashkinu troops. The latter meaning some kind of essentially like middle trooper of some sort, so not literally just the peasants, but something more affluent. As you see here, this is basically a platoon, right? So it's not really a big force, but it is something you could find yourself like out there in some isolated farm to cope with. It was a real issue, and these people were essentially not particularly endowed with any sense of human mercy, so or perception that you were a human, by the way, which is even more interesting, depending also who was in charge here. And again, it's a matter of hierarchies, it's a matter of elites and authority, etc. Now, 2000 Abiru seized Zalu on the Euphrates at some point, north of Carchemish, and an Abiru leader became such a threat to the rival rulers Shuvardata of Hebron and Abdu-Heba of Jerusalem that they joined forces and were given 50 chariots from Akko and Akshaf for support. And these are, as you understand, also the same areas that would later be settled by the Jews, that in a sense were some hybrid part of this mechanism of incursion, of destruction, and so on. And in fact, developing an important warlike culture you can see, in fact, also in the Old Testament being quite explicit. And we'll come back on Jewish warfare because it's really mind-blowing and very interesting. We've seen the Jewish countermeasures, the Egyptian countermeasures to the same Canaanites, because, by the way, those infested these other guys, especially in the Jews' territories, but also the Egyptian frontier to a degree, because the Canaanites were not very nice people themselves. They were a bit more advanced than, as we've seen, especially these nomads, but at large, they were really, on their own, pretty warlike, and were, as we've seen, also struggling for survival, in a same sense. And you had to take down these rebels because they could become the next rulers on this route. Politics were not so stable to simply offer distinct or easy, absolute, bulletproof protection from these guys. So this is actually the most important aspect of the war. Now, chariots might have been especially useful, by the way, for chasing down and wiping out Abiru raiders, especially, as we said, the Amorites at Samaria were mostly on foot. We've seen them operating with chariots, but they weren't really, let's say, at least in a proportional sense, provided with that backbone, that shock force that the Canaanites specifically would have here. Probably also these chariots, we said it, were smaller, just we don't have terrific evidence for pinpointing exactly the type of chariot that would be used here and there. There would have been some kind of B-series ones that probably you can't see, and it's likely, again, that these raiders had something sooner. After all, we know this. We talked about this in the videos about those early Iranian peoples, like especially in the Zagros Mountains at Samaria, that were just having small. This is true also for other parts, also in Europe later on, like the fringe areas with tougher terrain or less wealth, etc. Like had smaller, but sometimes very agile chariots that didn't have that shock force, but could still be operated on pretty tough terrain, at least compared to the bigger ones of the lowlands, right? So these groups, by the way, provided this Bedouins, this Apiru, as we see, provided shelter and possible backing for political exiles, as we pointed out before, so that those thrown into the dust were sometimes the same Canaanites, like Labaya, for example, used their aid to become ruler of Shechem. And this is really happening at the on a regular basis. Really, we see this in there is plenty of evidence. The same can be said for Idrimi, who escaped to these Apiru with just his chariot and a groom, later rising to rule Alalach as well. So again, we're talking apparently and co-curricular, like also small units, small phenomena, etc., the numbers here are often unknown, by the way, but sometimes, as we've seen before, administratively speaking, we actually have enough data to at least understand what the scale of warfare, in fact, really was, and how, in fact, these forces play out. Would actually add that even though the best way to use chariots was in this more punching force with bigger numbers, in the smaller engagements, chariots would have sometimes even a bigger edge, right? And this is a bit difficult to explain, but being the dominant arm and normally in smaller encounters, the outcome being wilder, right? There would have been cases in which maybe the charioteer was taken down just by a lucky shot, which was included in these options, but it mostly widens also the capacity of, for example, like an isolated Mariana to take down so many enemies at a time with different... there were, in this sense, many for him, but not such a great force. And so to gain also a terrific military experience, in mostly individual terms. We've seen that Canaan was a bit the land of that too in the countryside, so nothing to be surprised of. So don't underestimate. We've seen also the proportions, like there were lots of chariots also in the last examples compared to the foot soldiers, for example. Like 1 to 3, right? Which is probably mirroring, again, those war bands. They were more qualitative in relative terms, and that really were particularly the kind of again, an even more shock force in relative terms. Excuse me, I got distracted. Now, aside from this, again, there were mercenaries of different kind. We know, for example, that Shardanu mercenaries are noted in connection with Byblos and Ugarit. This is also completely fine. Like, we could, as we just said, contract some of these troops that were also from relatively underdeveloped places, but that, in fact, were just coming there for greater, for more income that it could get more steadily from these powers. This is pretty much it. So hopefully we will come back talking about these, so especially with troops types, because covering tactics, organization, etc. Like aside from battles that are also very, very interesting and out there, like there is, of course, like the single trooper to look at, which is very often the key to understanding very also technical aspects of combat, of tactics that are in turn the reflection of essentially a societal reality. We can immediately understand essentially the basis of the look, that naturally more or less knowing also what the other peoples were in this specific time, because there is all a specific scanning here, like the chronology is not random, to understand more or less the level of development politically, socially, etc. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.